Blood and Thunder by Hampton Sides. Chapter 1. Jumping Off. In the 2 decades he had lived and wandered in the West, Christopher Carson had led an unaccountably full life. He was only 36 years old, but it seemed that he had done everything there was to do in the western wilds. He had been everywhere, met everyone. As a fur trapper, scout, and explorer, he had traveled untold thousands of miles in the Rockies, in the Great Basin, in the Sierra Nevada, in the Wind River Range, in the Tetons, and in the coastal ranges of Oregon. As a hunter, he had crisscrossed the Great Plains any number of times following the buffalo herds. He had seen the Pacific, been deep into Mexico, pushed far into British-held territories of the Northwest. He had traversed the Sonoran, the Chihuahuan, and the Mojave Deserts, gazed upon the Grand Canyon, and stood at the life-leached margins of the Great Salt Lake. He had never seen the Hudson or the Potomac, but he had traced all the important rivers of the West, the Colorado, Platte, Sacramento, San Joaquin, Columbia, Green, Arkansas, Gila, Missouri, Powder, Bighorn, Snake, Salmon, Yellowstone, Rio Grande. Carson was present at the creation, it seemed. He had witnessed the dawn of the American West in all of its vividness and brutality. In his constant travels, he had roamed off of or intersected with nearly every major tribal group and person of consequence. He had lived the sweep of the Western experience with the directness few other men could rival. At first glance, Kit Carson was not much to look at, but that was a curious part of his charm. His bantam physique and modest bumpkin demeanor seemed interestingly at odds with the grandeur of the landscapes he had roamed. He stood only 5 feet 4 inches, with stringy brown hair grazing his shoulders. His jaw was clenched and squarish, his eyes penetratingly gray-blue. His mouth set in a tight little downturned construction that looked like a frown of mild disgust. The skin between his eyebrows was pinched in a furrow, as though it had permanently creased from constant squinting. His forehead rose high and craggy to a swept-back hairline. He had a scar along his left ear, another one behind his right shoulder, both left by bullets. He appeared bow-legged from his years in the saddle, and he walked roundly with a certain ungainliness, as though he were not entirely comfortable as a terrestrial creature, his sense of ease and familiarity of movement tied to his mule. He was a man of odd habits and superstitions. He never would take a second shot at standing game if his initial shot had missed. This, he believed, was bad medicine. He never began a project on a Friday. He was fastidious about the way he dressed and cleaned any animal he killed. He believed in signs and omens. When he got a bad feeling about something or someone, he was quick to heed his instincts. A life of hard experience on the trail had taught him to be cautious at all times, tuned to danger. A magazine writer who rode with Carson observed with great curiosity the scout's unfailing ritual as he prepared to bed down for the night. His saddle, which he always used as a pillow, formed a barricade for his head. His pistols, half cocked, were laid above it, and his trusty rifle reposed beneath the blanket by his side, ready for instant use. You never caught Kit exposing himself to the full glare of a campfire. When traveling, the writer noticed, Carson scarcely spoke, and his eye was continually examining the country, his manner that of a man deeply impressed with a sense of responsibility. When he did speak, Carson talked in the twangy cadences of backwoods Missouri. Thar and har, ain't and yonder, that-a-way, crick, and I reckon so. It seemed right that this ultimate Westerner should be from Missouri, the Ure country, of the trans-Mississippi frontier, the mother state. Out west, Carson had learned to speak Spanish and French fluently, and he knew healthy smatterings of Navajo, Ute, Comanche, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Blackfoot, Shoshone, and Paiute, among other native tongues. He also knew Indian Sign Language, and one way or another could communicate with almost any tribe in the West. And yet, for all of his facility with language, Kit Carson was illiterate. Although he was a mountain man, a fraternity legendary for swilling and creative profanity, Carson was a straight arrow, as clean as a hound's tooth, as one friend put it. He liked poker, and he often smoked a pipe, but he drank very little and was not given to womanizing. He was now married to a Hispanic girl from Taos. Josefa Jaramillo. Slender, olive-skinned, and 18 years his junior, Josefa possessed a beauty of the haughtily heartbreaking kind, according to one smitten writer from Ohio who got to know her. A beauty such as would lead a man with the glance of an eye to risk his life for one smile. Only 15 years old when she was married to Carson, Josefa was a bit taller than her husband. She was a dark-complected, bright-eyed woman whom one family member described as very well built and graceful in every way. Cristobal, as Josefa called him, was utterly devoted to her, and to please her family, he had converted to Catholicism. Especially now that he was a married man, Carson gave off none of the mountain man's swagger. There was nothing like the fire-eater in his manner, wrote one admirer. But to the contrary, in all his actions, he was unassuming. An army officer once introduced himself to Carson, saying, "So this is the distinguished Kit Carson, who's made so many Indians run." To which Carson replied, "Yes, but most of the time they were running after me." His sense of humor was understated and dry, usually delivered with a faint grin and a glint of mischief in his eyes. When amused, he was prone to sharp little barks of laughter. He spoke quietly, in short, deliberate sentences, using language that was, according to one account, forcible, slow, and pointed, with the fewest words possible. A friend said Carson never swore more than was necessary. Yes, Christopher Carson was a lovable man. Nearly everyone said so. He was loyal, honest, and kind. In many pinpointable incidents, he acted bravely and with much physical grace. More than once, he saved people's lives without seeking recognition or pay. He was a dashing good Samaritan, a hero even. He was also a natural-born killer. It's hard to reconcile the much-described sweetness of his disposition with his frenzies of violence. Carson could be brutal, even for the West of his day. A West so wild it lacked outlaws, for no law yet existed to be outside of. His ferocious temper could be triggered in an instant. If you crossed him, he would find you. He pursued vengeance as though it was something sacred, with kind of a dogged focus that might be called tribal, his tribe being the famously grudge-happy Scottish-Irish. When called upon to narrate his exploits, which he did reluctantly, he spoke with a clinical lack of emotion, and with a hitman's sense of aesthetics. He liked to call his skirmishes pretty, as in, "That was the prettiest fight I ever saw." He spoke of chasing down his enemies as sport. After participating in a preemptive attack, others called it a massacre, on an Indian village along California's Sacramento River, Carson pronounced the action a perfect butchery. By the macabre distinctions of his day, he was regarded not as an Indian killer, but as an Indian fighter, which was, if not a noble American profession, at least a venerable one. But Carson did not hate Indians, certainly not in any sort of abstract racial sense. He was no Custer, no Sheridan, no Andrew Jackson. If he had killed Native Americans, he had also befriended them, loved them, buried them, even married them. Through much of his life, he lived more like an Indian than a white man. Most of his Indian victims had died in what he had judged to be fair fights, or at least fights that could have gone the other way. It was miraculous he was still alive. He'd had more close calls than he could count. Because Carson's direct words were rarely written, it's hard to know what he really thought about Indians, or the violence of his times, or anything else. His autobiography, dictated in the mid-1850s and turned into a biography by a tin-eared writer who has charitably been described as an ass, is a bone-dry recitation of his life and leaves us very few clues. It was said that Carson told a pretty good story around a campfire, but his book carefully eschews anything approaching an insight. His refusal to pontificate was refreshing in a way. He lived in a golden age of windbags. But at the same time, his reticence in the face of the few big subjects of his life was remarkable. He was, and remains, a sort of sphinx of the American West. His eyes had seen things. His mind held secrets. But he kept his mouth shut. I hope you've enjoyed today's excerpt from Blood and Thunder by Hampton Sides. For more works from this author, check his website at www.hamptonsides.com.